Welcome to an introduction to economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com. In this podcast we introduce inflation, defining inflation, looking at its effect and possible causes, and some suggestions about policies to control inflation. We begin with the definition of inflation. Inflation is the persistent tendency for the general price level to rise. We use persistent to indicate that we are not concerned with seasonal fluctuations in the price of goods, and we use general price level because we are not looking at a specific good in this podcast. The measurement of inflation is then taken as the percentage increase in the retail price index over the period of 1 year. A monthly basket of goods is chosen and a weighted average used. If we look at the general level of inflation over the past 50 years, it is evident that inflation is something that has always been taking place. But in the 1970s and 1980s, there were two very clear spikes of high inflation. These spikes resulted in hardship for many people, and economists look closely at such events to see if they can be explained and indeed avoided. The monthly basket of goods is not a shopping trolley that is pushed around a supermarket. It is the selection of goods, services and utilities that most households will use. This map shows those goods and services and also the relative amounts of income that a household will typically spend on these items. Of course, you will probably realize that your own expenditure may well differ slightly from this. The map here shows how these goods are weighted in terms of retail prices. You will notice that housing has the highest weighting, with motoring and food expenses also being highly weighted. The sensitivity of these prices to other factors is indicated, but this need not concern us at the moment. Housing would be sensitive to demand, to interest rates, to rent prices, and to availability of funds for mortgages. There are two different indexes that are commonly quoted. The Retail Price Index and Consumer Price Index can both be used. There are 2 points to note here. The first is that CPI is nearly always slightly higher than RPI, which is significant for pensions and others whose increases are related to a price index. The second is to note that both indexes follow the same general pattern. What effect does inflation have on our everyday lives? In reality, this depends on whether you are aware of it and can do something about it. With anticipated inflation, then, if you obtain sufficient compensation, meaning that your income rises in the same way, then the effects are not likely to be great. The overall income and wealth will remain the same. The problems arise when the inflation rate exceeds expectations. We call this unanticipated inflation. When this happens, there will be some groups who will either fail to get full compensation or who are not in a position to get compensation. Nearly always with inflation, there will be some people who are better off and some who are worse off. And there are also some who simply take longer for income to catch up with inflation and so are temporarily worse off. So, if there is a redistribution of income after inflation, who is affected and how? Those who will suffer most will be those who are weakly unionized and those on fixed incomes. A weak union will have very little power to negotiate increases for members. An industry where there is no union leaves workers without representation to negotiate. Many pensioners are dependent on investments to provide an income to supplement a state pension. They are badly hit. From around 2007 onwards, interest rates on savings have been well below the inflation rate. So their savings and any fixed income from savings have been eroded considerably. Strong unions, in contrast, may actually be able to negotiate wage increases that are above the inflation rate. If you borrowed money and the rate of inflation increases, then you are gaining, since your repayments will be less in real terms than you had originally budgeted for. In contrast, your lender is worse off because they are not receiving the return they expected. With inflation in 2010 and 2011 running close to 5%, the lending rates remain high, even though the base interest rate is less than 1%. Can you see why this should be? The government gains from taxpayers if there is a system that uses personal tax allowances and tax bands. This is because of fiscal drag, meaning that the tax rates only adjust after the inflation has occurred. Public sector workers also suffer more than private sector workers, since they can have wages controlled more easily by a government. Wage earners who negotiate higher than inflation increases are benefiting at the expense of stockholders, who are then seeing lower profits in the business they have invested in. Inflation carries a number of additional costs. It is not just that prices increase. Households will need to spend more time searching for goods they can afford if rates of inflation rise steeply. And each alteration of prices can cost retailers money as they have to reprice and relabel. One cost to the economy in the 1970s was the loss of output. As unions sought to keep pace with inflation, they increased industrial action to obtain compensation. Inflation also affects a country because trading takes place across borders, so the relative value of the currency can be changing. If there is a fixed exchange rate, then it becomes harder to export. The prices of goods will be rising, so they will cost more to a buyer from overseas. To make it more difficult for home producers, imported goods will be relatively cheaper, making it harder for home industry to compete. The end result can be a large increase in a deficit for balance of payments. A floating exchange rate will also have problems. The country with the fastest rising inflation rate will see its currency depreciate. That can lead to spiraling inflation. In more serious instances, it may lead to speculation involving large-scale selling of currency. At its worst, it can lead to a loss in confidence of the currency, making trading very difficult. Now let us consider some of the theories relating to causes of inflation. The first of these is demand-pull inflation. When there is either full employment or the economy is close to full employment, and the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate output, then this can lead to inflationary pressure. If prices are rising through excess demand, then wage demands increase, increasing costs further, and there is a danger of a spiral. There are a number of potential causes, including an increase in consumption, increase in exports giving fewer goods at home, a rise in the money supply, and an increase in government spending. An increase in money supply, as an example, shifts the LM curve to the right, so the equilibrium point at full employment is shifted right, giving demand for higher income. The degree to which the shift is reflected in income is termed the inflationary gap. Similarly, a shift right of the IS curve will have the same effect. There will be an inflationary gap. The IS curve would be shifted by an increase in real spending, in other words, by an increase in consumption. A second theory looks at the effect of rising costs in the price of raw material or of wages. This is referred to as cost-push inflation, because it is not driven by demand, but pushed by costs of inputs. If the increased costs are passed on to the consumer, then prices rise, the wage buys less, the demand is for higher wages. Again, this is said to be associated with full employment and with unions. The argument is that full employment brings competition from employers to attract labour, resulting in higher than normal wage increases. Both the demand pull and cost-push theories are related to the idea that inflation is more likely to occur if the economy is at or close to full employment. It also suggests that at high levels of unemployment there should be low inflationary pressure. This idea was tested empirically by Phillips using data from 1861 to 1957 relating to employment and inflation in the United Kingdom. The result of his work was the Phillips curve, which suggested a close relationship over a long period of time. In fact, even when figures were used in the 1960s, the relationship seemed evident. And then something started to happen that was not expected or predicted. The map now shows that from 1970 onwards, the unemployment rate has fluctuated and appears not to have a direct relationship to inflation as measured by real wage inflation. It seems possible to have a high inflation and high unemployment rate at the same time. The monetarist view on inflation is that it is caused by excess demand and then sustained by expectation, which suggests a possible reason for inflation to spiral. There is some empirical evidence that there is a relationship between money supply and price levels. If you increase the money supply, then prices will tend to rise. This would also support the idea that government overspending will cause inflation by increasing the money supply. Friedman claimed that there was a different short-run curve for each different rate of inflation, and that the long-run curve was stable. If the long-run curve is vertical, as shown, then rate of inflation could rise or fall while the level of unemployment remained the same. Others have suggested that the long-run curve was simply steeper. The only real thing we can note from this is that it may be that increasing unemployment could lead to accelerating inflation. More recently, there have been theories about labour responding to inflation by making demands based on expected levels of inflation. Adaptive expectations suggest that the past error in guessing inflation is used for the next period. This rather assumes people do not learn by their mistakes. The rational expectation hypothesis says that people have more knowledge and are using that to predict a rate of inflation. Some new classical economists now suggest that any relationship between inflation and unemployment may be only short-term. The failure to produce an adequate explanation means there is a proliferation of other views. At one end of the spectrum is the idea that militant trade unions cause inflation with excessive wage demands. Others argue that individual events can influence inflation. This would certainly be supported by the rising price of oil in the 1970s and the effect on prices of so many goods. Flexible exchange rates leading to a depreciating currency can be a factor. And today we are more likely to consider a number of factors which could lead to pressures that raise the level of inflation. If there were clear causes, then there would also be clearer solutions. But what we are left with at present is a variety of policies. They can be divided into groups. Fiscal and monetary policies can be implemented by a government. The Keynesian approach suggests reducing government spending and increasing taxation to control inflation, whilst monetarists would favour a cut in the money supply. A liberal view, to have prices and incomes policies based on voluntary agreements, has been proposed, but in the end, if prices or wages are to be controlled, it would probably involve legislation. The idea of linking wage increases and price rises to indexes is popular among some theorists. This does not reduce the costs of inflation, and it may give a trigger for unions to set targets to go above the index to get real wage increases. This ends our short podcast on inflation, brought to you by Park Bench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies. For further information about Park Bench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com.